Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Devisha. I'm a faculty at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today we are going to talk about disaster risk reduction for natural hazards. This module discusses disaster and related risks to different groups. It also discusses steps for reducing disaster risk and mitigation strategies. The components of today's discussion would be thus: introduction, categories of disasters, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, description of major disasters, ecosystems and disasters, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. Let's start with the introduction. Now, the effects of earthquakes, landslides, drought, floods, storms, and tropical cyclones severely threaten human survival and sustainable livelihoods. And these are causes of major loss of human lives and livelihoods and destroy economic and social infrastructure. Natural disasters, often exacerbated by environmental degradation and mismanagement, adversely impact the environment. With sound management, the reverse proves true, thus establishing a direct link between disaster mitigation and environmental management. Now let's look at the different categories of disasters. Disasters has been categorized into 5 subgroups depending on generic considerations and various departments or ministries dealing with various aspects. The subgroup number 1 is the water and climate related disasters. This subgroup includes floods and drainage management, cyclones, tornadoes and hurricanes, hailstorm, cloudburst, heat wave and cloud wave, snow avalanches, droughts, sea erosion, and thunder and lightning also is included in this. The second subgroup is the geologically related disasters. Now it includes landslides and mud flows, earthquakes, dam failures, dam bursts, mine fires, etc. Now the subgroup number 3 is the chemical, industrial and nuclear related disasters. In this category, the chemical and industrial and nuclear disasters has been included. Coming to subgroup number 4, it is the accident related disasters. Now forest fires, urban fires, mines, flooding, oil spill, major building collapse, serial blasts or festival related disasters, electrical disasters and fires, air, road or rail accidents, boat capsizing or village fire have been included in this disaster type. Now subgroup number 5 is the biologically related disasters. This subgroup includes biological disasters and epidemics, pest attacks, cattle epidemics, etc. and even food poisoning. Now let's come to what is disaster risk management. It is the systemic process of using administrative decisions, organization, operational skills and capacities to implement policies, strategies and coping capacities of the society and communities to lessen the impacts of natural resources and related environment and technological disasters. Now, if you look at the disaster management continuum, you'll see that there are 3 aspects to it, which is the holistic and continuous process, there is proactive strategies, which is holistic and continuous process, and the fundamental to prompt and effective responsiveness. In the first arrow, just below proactive strategy, you can see prevention, mitigation and preparedness, which is the capacity development aspect of a disaster management. In the second arrow, which is the downward arrow, you can see responsiveness and rehabilitation, which is under the reconstruction phase of a disaster. This basically leads to recovery from disasters. Now let's look at disaster risk reduction. Now, the conceptual framework that was just explained has elements considered with the possibilities to minimize vulnerabilities and disaster risk throughout a society within the broad concept of sustainable development. Disaster risk strategies include vulnerability and risk assessment, institutional capacities building awareness. Essential features include effective early warning systems, scientific technical, educational, and other skill abilities. Now, the crucial involvement of local community action can be motivated by the acceptance of shared responsibilities and cooperation. Modern forms of information access and communication can facilitate the wider exposure and networking. Now let's look at the first aspect that the first arrow showed, which is the prevention or early warning. Now, the provision of timely and effective information through identified institutions that follow individual exposed to a hazard, that allows basically individual exposed to a hazard to take action to avoid or reduce their risk and prepare for effective response. Now, example, community radios have been used to disseminate flood or cyclone warnings. The next aspect that we would be explaining here would be about mitigation. What is mitigation? It's a structural and non-structural measures undertaken to limit the adverse impacts of natural hazards, environmental degradation, and technological hazards. Now, example for this is construction of resistant housing, improving natural resources such as desalination of lands affected by seawater, etc. Now, preparedness is the next factor that we are going to talk about. Now, activities and measures taken in advance to ensure effective response to the impact of hazards, including the insurance of timely and effective early warnings and the temporary evacuation of people and property from threatened locations, are included in this. Example, creating administrative bodies, training of police, relief groups, communities for dealing with disasters are all part of it. Now, traditional practices of people around the world have been influenced by locally developed knowledge of weather patterns or naturally occurring indicators in plants and animals, or to forecast particularly harsh conditions. Even the wind patterns could show whether it would rain or not rain. Though imprecise, these methods demonstrate an awareness of potential risk that have led people to consider alternate courses of action in order to protect their livelihoods. Now let's come to the aspect of response. What is response? A variety of activities undertaken on short and long-term basis to deal with the effects of disasters. That's what is response. Now, rescue and relief operations undertaken after floods, earthquakes are very essential to reduce the loss of lives. The needs change as the time passes, and the response also needs to change along with it. Assessing the damage is most important in this time. Now, what is reconstruction here? Reconstruction is basically, in this, it is a very important aspect and most important time in which the development is undertaken to recover from the losses. Now, reconstruction of houses, psychological counseling of victims, rebuilding of economy are all part of reconstruction measures. In this phase, measures of resilience building need to be undertaken to prepare against future disasters. Now, disaster risk reduction strategies include vulnerability and risk assessment, institutional capacity building, awareness, etc. Now, essential features include effective early warning systems, scientific, technical, educational, and other skill abilities. The crucial involvement of local community action can be motivated by the acceptance of shared responsibilities and cooperation. Modern forms of information access and communications can facilitate the wider exposure and networking. So far we have covered the introduction about disasters, various types of subgroups of disasters, and also about disaster risk reduction. The basic management framework is also being covered. Now let's look into the description of major disasters. Let's start with floods. Now, floods, the European Union Floods Directive defines a flood as a covering by water of land not normally covered by water. Now, the word may also be applied to the inflow of the tide. Flowing may occur as an overflow of water from water bodies such as rivers, lakes, or ocean, in which the water overtops or breaks barriers, resulting in some of some of or that water escaping into unusual boundaries. Now here in India, flow of water in rivers increases usually in monsoon or when Himalayan glaciers melt. The water then spreads over flat plains along the rivers. These are the flat plains, and this is a natural phenomenon which enriches riverside agriculture. However, greed for land led to many efforts to claim the land for residential purposes. Technical measures such as building of walls to prevent flooding were taken, but are most ineffective against the natural events. This worsened the floods, and every year crores worth of damages to property and lives are experienced in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar and Assam and many other places in India. Regional plans discourage inhabitation within the floodplain zones, but this is disregarded by real estate developers. Even the state, for that matter, if you look at the Chennai airport in itself, is constructed on the floodplains of one of the rivers. Cyclones. Cyclones is another disaster that we would be covering today. Cyclones are common occurrence among the coast of Bay of Bengal. Now, in 1999, super cyclone was then the strongest recorded tropical cyclone in northern Indian Ocean, and among the most destructive in the region. It affected Orissa and Sundarban regions, which was not prepared for the disaster. Government estimates around 9,000 deaths in coastal Orissa alone during that time. Now, cyclones in Bay of Bengal are expected to get worse and are frequent due to climate change. Lessons from the past led to Orissa government undertaking massive disaster risk preparedness and management efforts. Now, in 2013, when severe cyclone storms hit east coast of India, it was the most intensive tropical cyclone to make landfall in India since 1999 Odisha cyclone. Now, state governments were prepared for the event and carried out India's biggest evacuation, with more than 550,000 people moved up from the coastline in Odisha to Andhra Pradesh to safer places. Now, 44 people were reported dead, but compared to 1999 cyclone, it was very low. Loss of property was also comparatively less. This shows how preparedness and mitigation can actually help. Now, one of the lessons learned in earlier cyclone studies was how mangrove forest alone along the coast can minimize the impact of cyclone on villages. Now, government has since conducted massive mangrove restoration efforts all along the coast, which benefits the communities and lead to ecological resilience in the region. Now, let's come to another disaster, which is the earthquakes. Earthquakes regularly affect Himalayan region, and many areas in western India have also been devastated by earthquakes in the past. In 1993, earthquake struck Latur district of Maharashtra, destroying 52 villages, killing around 10,000 people and leaving 30,000 injured. Studies later led to reclassification of earthquake-prone areas. Now, heavy damages were attributed to occurrence at night, and loose stones housing are common in this particular area. The state of Maharashtra totally revamped its disaster risk management policies by designing of improved administrative legislations and building standards. Since then, construction of earthquake-proof housing has been promoted. In 2001, Gujarat earthquake just lasted 2 minutes and took around 13,000 to 20,000 people were dead, and around 1,67,000 people injured, and around 4 lakh homes were destroyed. Now, in the aftermath of Gujarat earthquake in 2001, Self-Employed Women's Association Seva was instrumental in ensuring that relief supplies reached women equitably, as they maintain lists of member houses in some of the worst affected areas. Now, recognizing women's urgent need for income following the Gujarat earthquake, Seva not only helped direct and direct or deliver emergency food, clothing and water, but also provided craft kits to young women artisans eager to begin work again, even after even when they lived in the houses, like housed in tents basically. They continued work on building livelihoods resilient to any disasters. Now let's look at ecosystems and disasters. Now, disaster reduction is closely linked to environment system, yet another pillar of sustainable development. Disasters affect the built environment and also the natural environment. Natural resource degradation leads to an increased frequency of small or medium impact disasters such as recurrent floods or minor landslides, as well as slow onset disasters such as land degradation and drought. Human activities have altered ecosystems across the world. Now, the ability to recover the natural disturbance has diminished considerably. A growing body of evidence links environmental degradation and competition for natural resources to many of the internal and international conflicts that contribute to many complex emergencies. Now, for example, desertification exacerbated the conflict in Darfur because it forced people to migrate from their homes into areas where they competed with others for scarce land and water. Now, severe environment stress, when accompanied by underlying social or ethnic conflict, poverty and weak governance, contributes to a violent conflict and complex emergencies. Although natural disasters strike in the industrialized and developed countries, developing countries remain the most vulnerable to these risks and sustain greater losses. Now, within developing countries, the poor and socially disadvantaged groups remain the most vulnerable. Often, the rural and urban poor occupy the most marginalized lands, relying on areas prone to drought, flooding, and other hazards for precarious livelihoods. In Mumbai, for example, the poor migrants from rural areas can only manage to live in the vast growing slums situated on low-lying areas or coastal mangrove flats, etc. Now, every monsoon, they are flooded by high sea tide spreading in the area, but there is no option to live elsewhere because the land prices are quite high. They also face greater exposure to hazards resulting from poor quality construction material and lack of access to information. Natural disasters frequently result in the degradation of water resources as well. Now, in flooding, the polluted water from the sewages and drainage mix with the drinking water sources and making it very unsafe for them to drink it. Children and pregnant women are particularly susceptible to waterborne diseases such as diarrhea, cholera that thrive in such conditions. Because of this role in managing household, water supply and domestic chores, women take greater risks. So as a result of slow onset disasters such as land degradation and drought, men's out-migration has increased in some parts of the developing world. According to some estimates, around 25 million environmental refugees have lost their homes because of environmental degradation or localized conflicts related to competition for resources. Uprooted populations generally encounter problems of protection and safety, with women in particular suffering sexual and physical abuse. Now, environment degradation increases the intensity of natural hazards and it is often the factor that transforms the hazards into a disaster. For example, river and lake floods are aggravated or even caused by deforestation, which in turn causes erosion and clogs rivers. As stated by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, social and economic systems are already affected by the recent increasing frequency of floods and droughts. Now, therefore, Successful disaster risk reduction or disaster reduction should enhance environmental quality, which includes protection of natural resources and open space, management of water runoffs, and reduction of pollution. Now let's come into the aspect of what is disaster risk reduction and sustainable development. What is the linkage? Now, disaster reduction has emerged as an essential requisite for sustainable development. The post-disaster reconstruction period provides the best time to introduce disaster reduction into sustainable development planning. Societies will become resilient when they integrate adaptive and risk management processes in sustainable development strategies. This implies the need to protect livelihoods against risk and uncertainty from global environmental changes based on trade-offs between different components of strategic development framework. Now let's come to the final topic on disaster risk reduction and sustainable development. Now, the disaster risk reduction has emerged as an essential prerequisite for sustainable livelihood. How so? Now, the post-disaster reconstruction period provides the best time to introduce disaster reduction into sustainable development planning. Societies become resilient when they integrate adaptive and risk management processes in their sustainable development strategies per se. This implies the need to protect livelihoods against risk and uncertainty from global environmental challenges based on trade-offs between different components of strategic and development framework. So today we have covered what disasters are, the introduction about disasters, various categories of disasters, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management is also covered, wherein the framework of disaster risk management was covered. We also looked into ecosystems and its linkages to disasters. And also finally covered the disaster risk reduction and its linkage to sustainable livelihood. I hope you have had a wonderful time in learning this module, and for enhanced reading I would suggest you to look into the ePathshala resource system. Thank you.